All right, a good day to everybody. We are here for the Credit and Collection News podcast. This is our sixth podcast, and we are really lucky today to have a panel discussing what's going on in the credit and collection news world. And our panel today consists of Leah Dempsey, who is the ACA's lobbyist and a shareholder in Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. She used to be the in-house counsel at the ACA and has tremendous command on the issues facing the financial services industry. Also from Brownstein is Sarah Auchterlonie. She has testified in front of Congress and previously worked at the CFPB. She's been very involved in many of the amicus briefs from the ACA at the federal level, including the recent one that we'll talk a little bit about. And our third member today is Andrew Nigrinis. He's the PhD economist who's now on his own, but previously with the CFPB. The ACA just engaged him to do a study on the economic impacts of the $500 medical debt credit reporting change on the SBR EFA panel submission. So I think we've got a great panel. We're going to be talking all about what's been going on in the industry, particularly with the CFPB, the FTC, and any other letters that we want to talk about today. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first topic is, of course, the CFPB, which is usually in the headlines on the newsletter, usually in the top articles almost every day because of all the items that are going on, including the new $8 fee, the CRA, the student debt, junk fees, etc. So let's go ahead and get started with that. And I'm going to turn this over, starting with Sarah, just talking a little bit about what's going on with the CFPB. So Sarah, looks like you're having a beautiful day. So we got to start with that great background just because
That's right.
you're there. Let's see if we can clear out the rest of those clouds talking about the CFPB.
That's how you know it's not a fake backdrop. The clouds move. Yeah, so I think the term of the day for the CFPB is junk fees. Of course, no one actually knows what that means, but they seem to be using it a lot and taking a lot of action as a result of it. So I hope you ask Andrew some questions about his view of the rule concerning $8 late fees for certain credit card late charges. We also have some fee rules coming out in other contexts. In addition, there's been some rulemaking for 1071 data collection, which requires now commercial lenders to put together about 80 points of information concerning their consumer loans, including requiring them to ask people if they happen to be LGBTQ. And other very personal questions like that when someone applies for a business loan. And we also have some, enforcement going on consistently. There's a lot of litigation out there that's been stayed, and we're waiting to see if the Supreme Court lets the agency continue to exist with its current funding model, or if we have a big disruption in the industry coming up in the next month or two.
That's a lot of hot topics. So definitely.
It's a lot.
Yeah, we'll definitely hit on all that. Leah, I'll let you chime in next before we jump over to Andrew, kind of, just talking a little bit about the CFPB now and your thoughts after kind of hearing what Sarah has to say. I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this week, ACA was actually in town. They had their fly-in event. So we had an opportunity to talk to almost 24 members of Congress and had many staff members, a couple different agencies, and talked a lot about the CFPB and this pending potential proposal related to medical debt credit reporting. We're also expecting that we may see the final rule on the non-bank registries for repeat offenders and for arbitration agreements coming out sometime soon. So a lot coming down the pike, I think, in the next few months. As Sarah mentioned, a lot of the work Congress may be doing, I think, probably hinges on the outcome of the Supreme Court decision. ACA participated with an amicus brief urging the court to provide a timeline if they did rule against the CFPB structure for Congress to act and to reconstitute the agency as constitutional. I think all of us who watch the oral arguments question whether the CFPB is actually going to lose this case, because it didn't necessarily look good for some of the industry participants in the oral arguments. However, we won't know until we see the decision. But if the court does strike down the CFPB, they may say something like Congress has to reconstitute it within 6 months, which really could create a lot of flurry between now and the election, and maybe after the election during the lame duck, if that happens. So a lot of conversations about that this week, a lot of conversations about the concern about the overreach, the concerns about how proposals like the medical debt credit reporting proposal are going to impact not only those in the collections industry, but also a lot of consumers and doctors and other underwriters and lenders, and pretty much everyone in the credit ecosystem. So I'm interested in hearing Andrew's thoughts on that, because I know he will probably have some colorful descriptions of his thoughts on where things are going to go there.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, I think both Sarah and Leah kind of set up the ball on the tee, and you're up to swing. So have at it.
Well, just remember, anything I say in terms of legal advice is the legal advice of a person with no legal training. My value added is as an economist, not as an interpreter of the law. The CFPB, since I left, just to give you an idea of my background, I was the first economist in the enforcement office. So my job was to, I like to put it, be the spear point of the CFPB to help them in their enforcement against industry practitioners for when they violated consumer finance law. I might come off as being against the CFPB. I'm all for consumer finance regulation. I'm very proud of the almost 6 years I spent at the CFPB. I think most people in industry agree that there needs to be a regulator who can set fair and honest rules so that we can have an efficient market. That being said, I'm looking forward to see what comes out of the Supreme Court, because my personal view is I don't think the CFPB is structured correctly. But again, that is the personal view of someone with no legal training. So it's always important to keep that in mind. I personally am a fan of the FTC model, the Federal Trade Commission, with a board or a panel with appointees from different parties as a way of creating a check and also being under congressional review or being appropriations from Congress as a check. That's just my personal view as a citizen. The one director structure, again, the lawyers can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like we went to the one director being completely insulated from politics through the appointment process. And then after the Supreme Court case, now the one director can be let go by the whim of a president, and has basically created an insulated director to one who has to eat out of the president's hand in order to continue his job. And I think it shows. It definitely shows. And the CFPB has definitely kept me busy with their rules. So where do we want to start? The $8 credit card fee rule? Well, that was an interesting, as an economist, I focus mainly on the cost benefit analysis that they're required to produce and their rationale from an economic perspective. I found that the CFPB's work was lacking in many respects out of the research office. And before I get too critical of it, remember, I worked with many of the research economists there. There's some really high quality PhD economists out there in the research office, which is why I'm surprised that a rule that has such large implications and can destroy so much value in a market can be allowed to basically move forward on such a weak analysis. But of course, like any agency, the work is directed by the political appointees, as it should be in a functional democracy, right? But that being said, the CFPB in their Office of Transparency says that they believe in being in potential of data to meet their mission, and that they want to acquire and analyze and publish high quality data in order to accomplish their mission, and they want to be transparent. I don't know about you, but I haven't really felt like there's been a lot of transparency coming out of the CFPB. I guess transparency is in the eye of the beholder. The CFPB in 2014, their Research Markets and Regulations Office had a budget of $79.7 million. Of course, not apportioned by Congress, which is a lot when you think about it. If you think that a PhD economist, between salary and benefits can cost about $250 to $300 a year, 10 economists is only $3 million out of that budget. It makes them larger than most university or a lot of college economics departments. So what have we seen? Well, we saw with the credit card late fee rule that they used the data series published by the Fed. I just want to make sure I get it right. They used cost-based on the Y14M data, which of course was created for the purpose of stress testing. The Bank Policy Institute has a great series of blog posts and reports explaining what's wrong with this data set and showing basically that a data set created for stress testing is not necessarily appropriate for creating costs for credit cards. Not, there's nothing more exciting than talking about management accounting, but it really does matter. There's a reason why you have those accountants and they make such good money, right? Because management accounting really matters. And how you divide up the cost really does affect the results. The CFPB has the budget to create their own data series. They also have the legal authority to compel the data from various credit card companies, issuers, acquirers, and the big networks. They have not done that. Not to get into the minutia of it, but the Y14M data set is not the appropriate data set. They augmented that data set and never shared the data. Furthermore, they never showed their code or their analysis to make their conclusions. To give you an idea, the $8 late fee is, and I kid you not, they calculated that the cost of credit card late fee collections, and they found that the cost was essentially what they did is they found the difference between the ratio of charge-off and collection costs of it being about $5. They took the average credit card late fee of $42, divided by 5, and then just rounded to $8. This is not very scientific. I'll leave it up to the lawyers. As I understand, the law says that a credit card late fee has to be set to an appropriate level. The appropriate being the key term of art here. They're interpreting appropriate to be to the cost basis. So for whatever reason, they believe that it should only be done at the marginal cost of collecting, and that comes out to $8. However, if you study a lot of consumer finance markets, you know that a point of the credit card late fee is not just about collecting at cost what the expenses of that $8, but it's also serves the purpose of, one, deterrence. You have to actually have people pay, because not paying your credit card is essentially a loan. Second, there's risk management issues. Credit card lending is very risky. And as we know, about in a normal year, about 3% of credit card accounts go delinquent. One of my favorite graphs from the CFPB is one that shows that after people go 60 days delinquent, they're 60% likely to come back into normality or not delinquent. Well, the problem with that is that implicitly says that 40% of the people who don't pay their bills within the 60 days are going to go delinquent for another month, which is 2/3 of the way to the 90-day definition of most firms use for delinquency. Well, given that the baseline is 3% and you have a metric here that will get you 40% of the way there, that's an extremely powerful metric. And to say that it doesn't have value in terms of being able to predict or risk of a consumer is just not true. The deterrence, they also they dismiss it with various very weak studies. They really do cherry pick the academic literature. And then so there's the deterrence argument. And then of course they, when in doubt, they like to act that everyone is predatory out there and that they're very hyper rational trying to maximize profits, and that the consumer is, when in doubt, they just assume the consumer is has some sort of foolishness, like some sort of behavioral bias. This is the classic saw that you see in a lot of CFPB work, where they'll use behavioral economics to get them out of the the rationality corner that they paint themselves in. So I like to think that consumers are hyper rational, but the problem with behavioral economics, and there's actually a great paper out there by from George Mason University, and I feel absolutely terrible because I'm blanking on his name. He's a really good law professor. But anyways, he talks about how there is no general theory of behavioral economics. So you do your behavioral economics research and you find 10% of people, they just don't pay attention to credit card payment dates. And they end up accidentally tripping the line. That doesn't tell you who in the 10%, who those 10% are in the population. I unfortunately happen to be one of those people who always forgets dates if it's not work related and if it's not written down on my calendar. And as a result, I always build certain metrics. You see the big banks, they do this a lot. They will send you text messages. They will make it easy for automatic bill pay, stuff like that. And I always like to point out is why would they want to do that? I mean, if they make so much money off credit card late fees? Well, because it has a risk management dimension to it. The more you make it easier for people to pay on time, when they don't pay on time, that signal has more value. So these are all legitimate points, but given that the agency has such a huge budget for their research office, they should be able to address these points sufficiently. Given that they have the legal authority to compel data, they should be able to do that. And given that they have the desire to be transparent, they should provide their analysis, including, in my opinion, code, to industry in order to be able to pick it over and decide, whether it's right or wrong. Because as we all know, mistakes can happen in the research process, which is why, we usually demand research to be peer reviewed. It's not just a tradition, but it serves a very important risk function. And none of that is being done by the CFPB. And for all their claim to be wanting to be a 21st century agency led by data, they sound very much like a 20th century Politburo, which is trying to tell you the way the world is and that you're going to accept it. And in my opinion, that is not correct. A research office should provide the cost benefit as unbiased as possible and leave the decision whether to implement a rule like an $8 fee as a political decision, a policy decision. They should not be putting their thumbs on the scale by doing a shoddy analysis and essentially making the argument for the political decision makers. Now, I may have said a lot of things that I'm probably going to regret later. Anyways.
No, I wouldn't say regret at all. I says actually you basically opened up the floodgates, and now we've got quite the conversation that we can have. And I'm going to turn this back over to Sarah and Leah just to talk from moving away from an economist view to a legal view, since both of you guys are right in there. So your guys' thoughts on this?
So from an Administrative Procedure Act perspective, I think that there are some serious issues in two regards with the $8 rule. I mean, one is just the predetermination aspect of it. When an agency goes into a rulemaking process, they are required to have an open mind to evaluate the cost benefits, and to not be trying to artificially arrive at a designated spot. I mean, I think Leah can talk a little bit more about what's going on in the Hill regarding the junk fees, late fees, and sort of the populist movement that's causing this politically. But from my perspective, I see it as a legal APA issue. And the next is really also the market forces and just a concern about whether they're really achieving a consumer protection purpose. I don't know about you, but I cannot calculate an APR in my head. And we have now information from Synchrony that because the impact to their late fee revenue, they're going to initiate more of an APR-based system to encourage and incentivize people to timely pay. And frankly, I feel like that's less transparent than knowing that you're going to pay $25, $35 because as a direct consequence of an action. Instead, you're going to have some sort of murky APR consequence that nobody can understand ahead of time. I feel like that is to the detriment of consumers and the goal of transparency.
Yeah, those are great points. And it's interesting because I've been in the consumer finance world for well over a decade, and it's never kind of been politically cool to talk about consumer finance. So I have to say I get a little excited about that, even though it's not necessarily for a good reason. But really, for the first time ever in the past few years, the president has brought up consumer finance issues in the State of the Union. He actually talked about this specific rule in the most recent State of the Union. It was released, I think, 2 days before. So there's no question that it was a political move that I think the administration sees as a win with consumers. A lot of people, particularly right now, are trying to win over the vote of the college kids that are out there protesting right now, which we might get into some conversation about later. But the college kids in general and the people in their 20s. That's the vote that both sides of the aisle are trying to garner right now, and being against junk fees and being against credit card fees and being against paying your medical debt all sounds very good from the bully pulpit and sounds very good on paper. So we are seeing a lot of that, and Congress is responding. We saw a Congressional Review Act challenge to the credit card late fee rule. It passed out of the House Financial Services Committee. There's also a Senate version that Senate Banking Chair Tim Scott has introduced. Tim Scott, who's also, I think, hoping still to be the vice presidential candidate. So that all that being said, there's a lot of discussion about these topics, not just at the Bureau, but at the national level, which is really kind of strange because the CFPB is an independent agency that, as Andrew talked about before, wasn't an arm of the administration. And up until recently, it wasn't necessarily somewhere in the White House where you would see the CFPB director appearing for press releases. Because it was supposed to be separate, it was sort of supposed to be, a think tank to have economics and legal experts think through some of these ideas and come up with reasonable solutions. But now things have been thrown into the political spotlight, and I don't think that has necessarily been beneficial to some of the decision making that's been going on.
It definitely it's a hot political topic, and I know that we had Congressman Andy Barr on the podcast talking just about the financial services and in his role there, and he understands the industry. He definitely gets it. And again, Andrew kind of hit on this when he started talking about the numbers. When you start to look at the percentages, if 97% of the people are paying their bills on time and only 3% are not paying their bills on time, and that's the one that you're focusing on for the late fees, it does seem to be that the focus is more on the tail instead of the dog. And you should be looking more at the dog and saying, hey, what can we do for the 97% of the people that are paying their bills on time? And we shouldn't be penalizing the 97% of the people for the 3% who aren't paying their bills. And of that 3%, again, you're kind of looking at the 60% who will only go 60 days delinquent. Andrew, I'm using your numbers because I paid attention to what you're saying. As opposed to, and then the other 40% who aren't going to pay their bills and do it. And again, there might be a reason they're not paying their bills, or they could just be focused in on I'm not paying my bills this time because I don't want to, which again is a completely different subject and more of, what an agency is there to do, either to help the consumer get back on their feet, pay their bills, or for those that choose not to pay their bills because they don't want to, is a whole nother issue. And then how do you handle that particular consumer? So with that in mind, any other comments just on the $8 fee? Because I know we kind of, the $8 fee is part of what I know Sarah mentioned, junk fees. What are junk fees? There's a lot of them out there, and everything kind of gets on there. But if you go stay at a hotel and you're hit with a resort fee, everybody shakes their head when you go stay at a hotel and he says, okay, well, I'm paying $200 a night at the hotel. Plus there's a $50 resort fee. What does that resort fee get you? Well, you get pillows and a blanket, and you get to stay in the room. Well, what does my regular rate get me? You get pillows and a blanket, and you get to stay in the room. Oh, okay. Well, I don't understand the concept except that they're basically giving you a false.
I would just like to point out that that was already being covered by the FTC under its drip pricing rules. I feel like the hardest working person in the Biden administration is the one who keeps coming up with these new labels, like, or at least the most talented person in that administration. I mean, junk fees? Who likes junk fees? But one, there's no legal definition, so it seems to be you're cramming everything in as a junk fee. So as you were talking about the resort fee, that's drip pricing. That's already covered by the FTC. There's already laws about that, and the FTC was blanking, but they had a big conference on it like just a few years ago about how to deal with drip pricing. Airlines, same problem. You know, I'm no different than anyone else. I find these things annoying as well. But a credit card late fee, that's not a junk fee. Well, I can't really say in terms of law because for two reasons. One, I'm not a lawyer, and two, I don't think there is a legal definition. And for the other reason that is there any reasonable person out there who thinks that they don't have to pay or they don't have to pay a fee if they're late on their credit card bill? Like, at what point does this be? Same thing with overdraft. Is there any reasonable person out there who does not believe that overdrafting their account is going to result in a fee of some kind? We can talk about the mechanics of it, the limits of it. These are all fine. You know, I'm not going to be dogmatic here. You know, these are all like policy questions. But in order to do policy questions intelligently, like Leah was saying, the idea of the CFPB as this kind of quasi-governmental think tank to try to come up with the best measure of how to deal with these problems, which is, you know, getting an honest assessment of costs and benefits. Well, there's a cost to reducing these late fees. The cost is that you're passing on the costs onto other consumers. Here's going to be the risk management costs, even if you cover the fee collection costs. And the best way to help consumers is to increase the supply of credit. But this rule will do the exact opposite. It should reduce the supply of credit. The only question is the magnitude. If you're in favor of the late fee, you're going to say the magnitude is very tiny and not very important. But as we saw just recently, it's barely new, or it's still being talked about. We see Synchrony raising the cost of credit by, I mean, well, I don't want to say great example. It's unfortunate that this is happening, but it shows that there's a real magnitude to this and there's a real cost. And the populist argument for lowering credit card fees is essentially to benefit a very small section of the population, giving them a very nice benefit. They're going to make a very small distributed cost on everyone else. But those costs do add up. I mean, they add up, well, in the Synchrony case, to quite a bit. And I think the overarching theme that's going on here, including the medical debt and other types of rules, is that you're seeing the argument made to kind of fiddle with the financial infrastructure. The financial infrastructure, as I like to think of it, is, you know, markets don't exist in a vacuum. Markets are human creations. You know, I hate to put it to the dogmatic Milton Friedman people out there. You know, they're not magical things that just exist. They're human creations that require systems of laws and regulations to function. We have pretty good functioning markets in the United States and for credit. But essentially, in order to reward one group of consumers, and I'm not going to speculate whether there's a political dimension to that, but in order to reward one group of consumers, they're fiddling with the financial infrastructure that's going to have very real costs to other people. And, you know, the goal of a research office at the CFPB is to give us an honest accounting of those costs. And the same thing, if this rule is coming out of the FTC, there should be an honest accounting of those costs. And I'm actually quite happy that someone is pumping the brakes on this rule by, you know, in Congress. But that's my soapbox. I'm going to stop my rant now.
Well, I would just add to that. I mean, your point about the FTC already regulating this. A lot of these so-called junk fees, you know, things like overdraft, things like credit reporting, have been highly regulated for years. You know, these are not new areas of consumer finance that need new regulation. You know, the Federal Reserve was regulating overdraft more than a decade ago before the CFPB even existed. And, you know, if you read some of these press releases, you would think no one's ever taken a look at these products before and there's no regulatory regime around them. And that's just not true. I mean, a lot of these products that the CFPB is talking about are subject to dozens of consumer finance laws at the federal level, additional protections at the state level. They're all, favorites of the trial bar. So there's, that added layer of someone keeping an eye on consumers. So to act like the Biden administration has just discovered these junk fees and they're the white knights saving everyone from these things is really a little bit laughable if you really think about it.
I think,
yeah, I agree with that.
I have to agree too. I don't want to interrupt you, Sarah. I was just going to say that timing is everything, and you know what? We have almost a 50-50 split in Congress, the Senate, and at the White House. And so elections coming up in November are vital. And so I think that you're seeing the ultimate what little stone can we overturn that's going to swing the election our way. And I think that's the reason that we're seeing this strategically now and not 3 years ago when we had the change of the administration. It didn't take 3 years to figure out that the fees were expensive. It's basically taken 3 years to figure out, oh, we're an election year now, so therefore it's vitally important to come up with another group of folks that will vote one way or another. And I think this is again, like Andrew kind of is, nobody likes junk fees. Nobody likes to pay extra. However, any reasonable person that does carry a credit card, if you don't pay your bill, unless you have a great excuse, and I mean, if you get in a car accident and you're in the hospital for 3 weeks, and you don't pay your bill, well, guess what? If you contact your credit card company, there's probably a good chance that they're going to forgive that late fee and do that because you say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm now out of the hospital. I can now pay that. Or they get a hospital bill, so they can't pay it, period. But that's another story. But the idea behind it is, hey, speak with your creditors. It's a one-time decision that they can figure out, is it right or is it not? But do we need to revamp everything from $39 to $8, particularly without what Andrew, I think, was hitting on the most, is without the full research that basically says it should be 39 or it should be 8? No one's really sure, but there's no numbers that back up either. It's just an arbitrary number that they said, okay, this is what we're going to go to now. And is that political instead of, financial? Maybe. But that's another topic.
Well, I would just like to add one extra dimension to what you're saying is, the one way we can determine what late fees should be is by allowing markets to operate. This argument that goes through the CFPB over and over again, that somehow there's this concentration in the industry and that, terms are being dictated to consumers. There are thousands upon thousands of credit card issuers, and even the competition is pretty heavy amongst the top 10. I mean, there's, the top 10 banks, right? Like your Wells Fargo card, your Chase card, whatever you're talking about. There's a lot of competition, never mind co-branded cards and then, store-specific cards. If late fees are really that important, you can self-select away from them, which again, is the obvious answer for a lot of people, which is why the CFPB so often has to lean on behavioral economics research. When they realize that the rational markets won't give them the policy conclusion that they want, they immediately start pushing towards people who are not fully rational and hence are being predated upon. Again, I'm not a dogmatic. The behavioral economics research is quite interesting. But like a lot of things in behavioral economics, it's a very, very small partial glimpse, and that most can tell you that behavioral theory is consistent with the evidence. I don't think off the top of my head I can ever remember reading a behavioral paper saying that it explains the evidence or it's causal. So, where is this coming from? And there needs to be a justification for this. And if you're going to tell me that 10% of people are, foolish enough that they keep, forgetting to pay their fees, I'm pretty sure I'm in that 10%, but I take defensive actions. One thing I like to do is at the end of every month, I clear the deck of everything I need to pay because I know if it's due on the 12th, I'm not remembering, which I guess does not speak very highly about myself, but keep that in mind. But I think that's a normal response, right? A lot of people do this. And they just keep leaning back on these economic theories that, behavioral economics is a major contribution to the field of economics, but I don't think it's ready for prime time to be the basis of making multi-billion-dollar decisions.
Sarah, I think you had something to input that I think I interrupted. So I'll turn this back to you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to echo what Andrew said earlier, is that the United States market is very well functioning. And a lot of that has been because since the 1970s, at least, the perspective of the Consumer Credit Protection Act has been about disclosure and transparency. And that if you give the right information to consumers, they'll make the best decision that's good for their household and their personal circumstances. And what we're seeing right now with the CFPB putting its finger on the market is a move away from that system. Instead of allowing people to decide for themselves, they are mandating certain controls. And, as you mentioned, with the hospital and medical issues, Steve, they're even going the other way and trying to suppress relevant and informative data about consumer behavior and consumer debts and consumer payments when it comes to a medical debt. Based on pretty spurious allegations that the medical debts may not be valid or their alleged debts, as well as pretty incomplete research as well as to how that's going to affect both the consumers themselves as well as the economy and medical providers.
I was just going to say one point to add about some of the claims out there that we think are questionable. The CFPB continues to cite complaint data in the medical debt space as one of the reasons they're taking a look at it. But as all of us that have been dealing with the complaint database for a while know, a lot of what goes in there is an inquiry. It's a question. It's not a violation of the law. And I think that's particularly true in the medical debt space because it's complicated for all of us to deal with health insurance. I don't think anyone on this podcast or anyone in the country has not had a complicated medical bill that their insurance company has not necessarily made it easy to understand or pay for. I'm like Andrew, where I forget to pay a lot of my medical bills because I'm too busy lobbying for the debt collection industry to pay my own debt collection bills. But they're complicated. So you kind of put them aside and you don't necessarily think about them. And then all of a sudden, a month or two later, you might get a text message or some sort of reminder. That's a good thing. Those are, for me anyway, I will not pay that bill unless I get a text message that allows me to easily pay it on the way to work and get it cleared off the deck. Those are all things that the CFPB and consumer groups try to make harder for consumers. They, during Reg F, did oppose some of the efforts to switch to texting and email, and now are focused on the credit reporting issue. All of these things can be helpful in making sure you have a good credit score to buy a house in the future, knowing that there's something out there that you legally owe. It's just odd to me how people that are supposed to be protecting consumers and advocating for consumers instead kind of focus on these pieces like the complaint database that, if you really dig through, would probably find that a lot of those complaints are actually just questions about health insurance or other kind of miscommunication items that I would bet the vast majority of the time when brought to the attention of collection agencies are immediately addressed and probably for the better of the consumer.
I actually worked on the complaint data set or database while I was at the CFPB helping someone.
It's all your fault. Just kidding.
Yeah, don't put that one on me. I was helping trying to figure out heads or like they have an analytics team in the complaint database, people who are really good. But the data set itself is sometimes just a mess. Like they can't match company names and stuff like that. And every complaint is treated equally. So there's no quality control. It could just be someone just ranting about something that's perfectly legal. Or it could be like a legitimate complaint. So yeah, I also find it strange that they keep leaning on the complaint database without actually doing something to standardize it, to make it into a more useful product. But again, I like the overarching issue I see at the CFPB going on here is they're fiddling around with the financial infrastructure. And they're doing it on a case-by-case basis without kind of thinking about the general effects to the consumer finance industry. So I don't know if dark patterns is still a thing that we worry about. It was big like a year ago, but there it was like, the old regime that Sarah was referring to about how, you would be transparent and you would throw up all these, terms of an agreement, right? Terms and conditions. Now that's no longer acceptable. Now, the question is, did the person really agree to have an overdraft or a credit card payment or something like that? Which is getting to, consumer sovereignty. They're trying to undermine that. Admittedly, they're doing it for what they think are good reasons, but it kind of leads to the next obvious question. Well, what's the alternative? There's no overarching discussion on what that alternative is. In terms of medical debt, we have a market-based healthcare system. It's going to produce financial payments, and some people won't be able to make those payments. The CFPB has no legal authority over the insurance industry. So it seems like instead they're trying to make changes in the medical industry by going after the financing of medicine. A key part of any financing scheme is going to be debt collection. To get rid of medical debts is to get rid of a major incentive, or medical trade lines off the credit report is to get rid of a major incentive to paying your medical debt. People don't want negative trade lines on their credit report. If you don't allow medical trade line reporting, what's the alternative? I like to say is like, suppose we lived in the world that the CFPB is trying to make us live in, right? If you're a debt collector, you either have to not report the debt or you got to go into some sort of civil litigation, which is very expensive. And the CFPB has no authority to take any civil litigation records off the courthouse records, right? What's going to happen to the medical providers? You're a local dentist. Let's live in the CFPB's world. You're a local dentist and someone's not paying you. Well, the CFPB doesn't seem to realize that one person's debt is another person's income. That debt to the dentist represents that dentist's income. And that dentist needs that income in order to be able to pay, the dental assistant, the physical location, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. What is that dentist supposed to do? It's not like he can put the tooth back in, right? So if the dentist can't put the tooth back in, he's provided the services. So, and, a larger, some people will always pay their debts purely out of social obligation, moral obligation. I'd probably fall into that camp. I tend to be late with things, but they still get paid. But, a debt is, it sounds so old fashioned to say it, but you're kind of honor bound to respect it, right? So you pay your debts. It's something I teach my 9-year-old daughter. I hope she grows up to be someone who pays her debts as well. But there's a fraction of people who will not. And it's not a moral judgment about people in general. There are always going to be some people who are not going to follow the rules. So these people follow the rules less because the incentive to pay the debts go down. How are you going to respond as a dentist? Are you going to raise your prices? Are you going to require collateralization of it before you provide the services? Like if you don't do this, I'm going to take your car or something like that. Will you provide financing, but at higher terms, like worse interest, in order to extract, collectively extract the amount that you lost? And when I did the survey for the ACA, sure enough, I find ranges between 5 to 10% reductions in the collections that are expected. The CFPB, with their millions of dollars, should be doing this survey. It should not be up to the ACA to contract with me to do this survey. It should be the CFPB who's doing this survey. They have their resources. It's their mandate to think about what are the implications of the rule. And lowering the ability to collect debts, having an impact on medical providers, is not a crazy theory. It's actually what I think most people would think is a common sense implication of this rule. Now, the question becomes one of magnitude. Well, the magnitudes I'm finding are 5 to 10%. Dentists are in competition with each other. They don't have a license to print money, though it feels like that sometimes. Very few industries can take reductions in their revenues of 5 to 10% and not have some sort of, bad implication. Maybe it'll be exit, especially in rural communities. Maybe it'll be the raising of prices, things like that. who pays this cost ultimately? Well, it's everyone, right? Like I look at my daughter, and as beautiful as she is, I realize she will need orthodontics one day. I want there to be a competitive market of orthodontists out there to provide those services for me, right? Has the CFPB thought about this? Have they tried to quantify it? No, not at all. Not at all. Now, you could say they don't need to because debt collection is some sort of monopoly industry, and they're going to absorb the costs of the industry, of the regulation. But last time I checked, debt collection is not in a monopoly. It's a very competitive market. And in competitive markets, when there's a structural increase in cost, it's usually passed on to their consumer because they don't have the margins to eat it. They're not Google, right? And their customer are the medical providers, and the medical providers are in competition. Who are they going to pass the cost on to? It's going to be the general public. So these costs need to be quantified. And I actually think it's a great failing of the leadership over at the CFPB that they do not have this data created, quantified, and providing us with how they built the analysis so that we can run our own analysis. Because aren't they not claiming to want to have a transparent process? Well, it's very easy to talk. It's very hard to do.
All valid points, and again, it goes back to what we started talking about earlier. We're in an election year, and you didn't hear a lot of this chatter 4 years ago, or maybe there was a lot of this chatter 4 years ago before the election, but that we were concentrating on COVID. But this is one of the hot topics right now, and the reason that you see these types of things at the State of the Union speech, junk fees. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about financial services. We're going to take it down from $39 to $8, but there's no true justification for bringing it down except for the fact that, well, we're telling you so. And it's a tough one. That's why you are seeing the lawsuits that are coming into the courts now that are saying these fees are not valid. How do you justify these fees and do it? And where is the court case going to be held? Is it going to be held in DC? Is it going to be held in Texas? Because in Texas, we find that the judges are more lenient towards the business side of it, where in a DC, they might be more politically motivated to vote another way. So you've got suddenly a massive, it all comes down to politics. And really, politics shouldn't be part of the decision, because the whole idea behind the CFPB and other regulatories is it's regulations. It's not political. But now what we find is actually everything is political. So how do you fight that and do that? And I guess you go through the courts, and you got to find your way all the way up to, and if it ends up all the way to the Supreme Court, and you've got a more conservative majority than a liberal majority, then maybe that's the way they go. But even that's not guaranteed, because as Leah brought up earlier, you start to find that people have different concepts of what is liberal and what is conservative. And you're going to find that maybe no one's going to sit there and say, I vote for $39 late fees versus $8 late fees, because that's political suicide. But what you might find is that businesses say that justifiably a $29 fee is much more reasonable than an $8 fee. I don't know. I haven't seen the numbers. I don't know. I think what they need to do is have Andrew crunch all the numbers and come up with the answer. So there's some more work for you. We just got to get someone to pay you, Andrew, so that way you can afford your orthodontics for your daughter. See how it's all cyclical? We're all there.
Well, economics is a beautiful field to study because it's based on very simple concepts that produce very complex structures.
And if you throw, I was going to say, if you throw in the legal aspect,
yeah.
Leah or Sarah, talk about that, because that's another wrench that goes against the wheel, because all of a sudden you've got all these legal aspects that what can you and what can't you do according to what's legal for all these regulatories.
So I would also say it goes a little bit beyond liberal, conservative, progressive, or moderate, what have you. I think you need to really look at how the money is flowing. Some of the greatest advocates for most of these positions are groups like the National Consumer Law Center, which has the word consumer in its title, but also happens to be one of the biggest trade groups for plaintiffs' attorneys. And so a lot of these positions that are being advocated for by the so-called consumer protection groups are really just positions that will allow the plaintiffs' attorneys to file more lawsuits. And this is good money for them, even if it's bad policy for consumers. So I think looking at some of these arguments in favor of the CFPB's movements with some skepticism is a smart thing to do.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, I think this might be putting my tinfoil hat on a little bit more, but some of the same arguments kind of apply to this medical debt piece, where the Biden administration and some political supporters have openly argued for universal health care. So, this week we were actually at the White House and had a meeting about this issue. And we're, kind of telling them all these same things about how we think this is not a great idea and it's going to harm, the whole medical system and our industry and others. And then when we walked out, we thought, well, maybe that is the goal, to kind of break down the system. And then we all have to have universal health care. So maybe we were actually telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. I'm not saying that's the case, but, it certainly could be at least partly true, that, people that are coming up with some of these ideas might not necessarily be thinking about all the same consumers that they're claiming to think about, and maybe thinking about their own political objective and their own ideas on some of these things.
I personally think a political strategy on rewarding people who pay their bills late is a very dangerous one for this administration, because even if it works, they may not show up to vote until November 30th.
I think that's the ultimate that you kind of hit on, Andrew, is, when you're trying to look for votes. And I think that's, as you progressively get closer and closer to the election, and you start to see, how am I going to win my election, whether it be presidential, whether it be senatorial, whether it be congressional, all the way down to the school board. Everything has its repercussions of how you vote and how you do, and how do people react accordingly. Right now, we started to talk a little bit about this, but you've got all these college protesters going on there. And then now you're not hearing a word about forgiving student loans. I know that there's more push out there, but it's pretty politically tough to sit there and say, yeah, all those people that are protesting, by the way, we're going to be forgiving all their loans. At the same time, while they're not going to school, they're busy protesting and making demands of their universities. That's a tough one to sell to the general public, because again, the general public is not in college right now. They're not going. You have a percentage that are paying for these students, but do you want to be part of the taxpayer base that is paying for student loan forgiveness, that are the same kids that are protesting and not going to school and causing all these damages to the universities? As a taxpayer, no, I do not. As a father who has kids in college, or one that's still in college, one that's just graduated, do I want to pay for somebody's kid that's destroying a university and pay for their loan, even though I worked so I don't have to? My kids didn't take out student loans. It's a very strong argument out there, and like I said, you're not hearing about it because it's politically not the smart move to make. Even though there were some big forgivenesses this past week and a half that were just put out there, but they all got buried because right now we're focusing in on the protesting and not focusing in on the forgiveness. But that's another, it's a hot topic and it's a political topic, yet it highly affects the financial services industry.
Yeah, and as an economist, it's always important to remember that when we're talking about economics, we're talking about the cost benefit analysis. And politics can take you into a lot of rabbit holes because politics is basically about how a society governs itself, the choices that have to be made. Economics is a positive science. It's about trying to predict the effects of choices. I mean, obviously, there's critiques that maybe the predictions aren't very good. I like to think we get better with time, but economics is about trying as best as possible to divorce the politics as much as possible in order to come up with costs, benefits to as many different individuals as possible. Those sort of social decisions have to be made by our political warriors on the various different sides of an issue, right? This is why I don't envy Sarah and Leah and their job. I just have to deal with dollars and cents.
Yeah, I mean, I think just beyond all the, crazy politics surrounding this, and I think your points are spot on. There's also the legal aspect that the Supreme Court already struck down the student loan forgiveness attempts by the administration, and the administration continues to try through the Department of Education and through other means to do all types of forgiveness that, arguably it looks like it kind of conflicts in some ways with what the Supreme Court already said about this. They just recently put out a proposal in the last few weeks related to student loan collections, and they talked about forgiveness based on hardship, but there was not a very clear definition of the word hardship. And this week when we were talking about some of these things on the Hill, someone made the joke that is it a hardship to be out there protesting, causing chaos in the streets? Is that something that you can claim as a hardship and then you don't have to pay your student loans? I don't think so, but who knows? Like, all of these courts could come down on these things a different way, and it really, I guess, is just, some of it is a little bit absurd when you take a step back and look at it, because there are all sorts of programs already in place for people that can't pay their student loans. There's programs for teachers and government employees and a lot of the people that we think deserve a break and are, very warning special treatment with student loans. That has been debated for also a very long time. The Department of Education has a number of different programs that address those things. So again, to pretend like there are many people out there in the world that have student loans that they can't afford, and that they have no options, I find it somewhat hard to believe, just because I have so many friends from law school that are not paying student loans who I know probably could afford to be paying them and have boats and second homes and things like that, and have found ways around the system. But I think we'll continue to see that debate unfold between now and Election Day.
I think that you just hit it right there. It's going to unfold between now and Election Day, but after Election Day, a lot of these things tend to go away until next Election Day, when suddenly they're either part of the system and they're part of, let's just say, getting votes, or they're not. And and right now, obviously, this is something that they've decided that they can get votes off of. And if they suddenly tomorrow something else became the ultimate decision maker on how people vote, that's where everything would be focused on, and everyone would forget what we're talking about today, because it's all about getting the votes in there. And that's kind of when you said elections matter. Elections do, because that's all the repercussions of what everybody is trying to do. People are not worried about, oh, if I don't win, it's no big deal. Everybody wants to win, and they want to win so that way they can control what happens. So that's the ultimate, is, in winning. And nobody wants to be on the other side of that. And that's kind of where we're at. And, you can look at it from an economical standpoint. And if the economics say you got to go one way, but you don't like what it is, you can always go the legal way and then try to change it and on that direction. So that's, there's so many different options to look at. But we know that come November, that's when election time is. So after November 6th, when the Election Day, or November 8th, whenever the actual date is, that's what you're looking at. That's your end goal, because come the day after that, or maybe a couple days after that, depending on how they count the votes, that's what you're looking at, and what you've got to see. And then all of a sudden, the bar completely changes, because you know your results, and you know the next election isn't for another 2 years. So there you have it. With that, we have gone through an hour already, and we're just scratching the surface. We're just kind of getting there. So I would say that, is there anything else that you guys want to jump on before we conclude this? I know we mostly talked about the CFPB. We never even really hit a few little points for the FTC. And we didn't even talk about other governmental agencies, because that would probably take hours, and nobody wants to watch a 7-hour podcast on credit and collections. No offense towards myself, but that's the reality of the world. But I'll throw this around to everybody. Is there anything else that you want to jump in and say before we conclude this session?
Just thanks for having us, and we'd be happy to come back again.
There you go. There you go. Andrew, any last words?
Last words, infamous last words. Other than the best way to make good policy is to have honest accounting of the costs and benefits. After that, it's a political decision, which is not my expertise. And I do not want it to be my expertise. But, honest accounting of the cost and benefits are absolutely important in order to be able to make intelligent policy decisions. And other than that, well, thank you for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your time.
Awesome. Leah, you get the final word. So now you can throw stuff out there as we end this, and no one gets a chance for rebuttal or anything. You got a good soapbox to jump on.
That's tempting. I'm thinking of what I can throw out there. No, I would just say, I think we obviously were a little bit critical of the administration here, but I would caution everyone that this is not a Republican thing. This is not a Democrat thing. There have been people on both sides of the aisle that I think have come down wrong on some of these issues. For example, J.D. Vance just signed on to a letter to a California credit union about overdraft that I think was misguided. And we've seen him work with the FTC, the Democrat FTC, and even Senator Warren. And we've seen some bipartisan efforts on some of these issues related to junk fees and some of the issues that we're talking about. So it's not really a partisan thing. It's I think a common sense thing. And as Andrew said, an economic and legal thing to follow the rules of the law, and to be cost benefit driven when you're creating policy. And that's what the three of us spend a lot of our time thinking about and working towards, and just appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about it today.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys spending the time with us today, making all this. You guys made great points. It's great conversation. There's probably a lot we could talk about. Love to have you guys all back, so especially maybe after the elections, to see how much of this comes true, and where do they focus on next, because you just never know. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the podcast. We appreciate those of you that have watched it and listened and made the comments. And hopefully we will have lots more coming your way, especially as we get closer to the elections, and more rules come out from our regulators in DC. With that, we are out for the day. Everyone, have yourself a great afternoon, and have yourself a wonderful weekend. Take care.